Cecil the Weasel, a Bernard Miller story, Part 1, The Web of Deceit. 2 years had passed since the tragic murder of Bernard Miller's wife Fiona, but the pain still clung to him like a shadow. Her death had been a cruel and senseless act, one that sent his world spiraling into darkness. Bernard had always prided himself on keeping his family safe. It was the very reason he'd left the NYPD when their son, Anthony, was born. He'd walked away from a life of danger, trading his badge for the quieter, more predictable world of technology, launching Tech One Computers in Pennsylvania. The company thrived, becoming the leading tech service in the tri-state area. For 9 years, Bernard thought he'd escaped the dangers of his past. Then, Fiona was taken from him, and the life he had built came crashing down. Her murder was no random act of violence. Bernard knew it had ties to his old life, to enemies he'd made as a detective. That realization sent him back into a world he thought he had left behind. But this time, he wasn't bound by the law. As a private investigator, Bernard operated in the shadows, driven by a relentless hunger for justice. He didn't just want answers, he wanted retribution. The quiet days of managing his business had been replaced by long nights chasing down leads, uncovering secrets, and bringing those responsible for Fiona's death to justice. Yet Bernard wasn't alone in his pursuit. His old comrades from the 23rd Precinct, Detective Cynthia Toussaint and Detective Hector Ramirez, had never turned their backs on him. Together, they formed an unofficial team, a trio of investigators who worked the cases that slipped through the cracks of the legal system. Where the police hit walls, Bernard and his team kicked them down. But their latest case, a hunt for a dangerous predator dubbed Cecil the Weasel by the media, was pushing them to their limits. Cecil Franklin was no ordinary criminal. Wealthy, intelligent, and highly connected, he navigated the upper echelons of New York society with ease. A serial rapist who preyed on successful women, Cecil was a master manipulator. His good looks and charm allowed him to move effortlessly among the elite, gaining the trust of his victims before drugging and assaulting them. He left no physical evidence and made sure his victims were too disoriented to remember crucial details about their encounters with him. The NYPD had been chasing Cecil for months without success, and the public outcry was growing louder by the day. Women across the city were terrified, and the media demanded answers. Bernard, Cynthia, and Hector had been following Cecil's trail for weeks, but he was always one step ahead. Every lead they followed led to a dead end. Every time they thought they were close, Cecil slipped through their fingers, disappearing like smoke in the wind. Bernard knew they needed a break. A mistake from Cecil, a shred of evidence, anything to tip the scales in their favor. It was late on a Thursday night when Bernard sat in his home office, staring at the multiple monitors surrounding him. The room was a cluttered mix of technology and case files, evidence of both his IT business and his private investigation work. Screens displayed security footage from various high-end bars and social events across the city, places Cecil was known to frequent. The whiteboard in the corner of the room was covered in notes, timelines, and connections. It was Bernard's war room, a place where he could think, analyze, and plot his next move. The door to the office creaked open, and Cynthia Toussaint entered, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. Her sharp brown eyes scanned the files scattered across the desk before settling on Bernard. She set one of the cups down in front of him and took a seat across from him. "Any new leads?" she asked, her voice tinged with the exhaustion that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. Bernard rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the case pressing down on him. "Just the same dead ends," he replied, his frustration evident. "Cecil's too good. He moves like a ghost. No witnesses, no physical evidence, nothing concrete. It's like trying to catch smoke with our bare hands." Cynthia frowned, flipping open her folder. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly, accentuating the determined lines of her face. "Ramirez sent this over earlier today," she said, handing Bernard a few sheets of paper. 2 more victims, same pattern, but one of them thinks she saw him again, this time at an art auction about a week after her attack. Bernard's eyebrows shot up. "He's that bold? He's going back out in public after every attack? He's either taunting us or he's confident that we can't touch him," Cynthia said, crossing her arms. "He knows how to blend in. He's wealthy, connected, and uses that privilege like a shield. Ramirez is combing through the auction house's surveillance footage, but you know how it is. Cecil's like a phantom. Bernard stared at the new victim statements, a sense of urgency creeping into his chest. He'd heard the same story over and over again. Women who were intelligent, successful, and accomplished, lured in by Cecil's charm, only to have their trust shattered. Each attack left his victims devastated, both physically and emotionally. Bernard's hands clenched into fists as he thought of the lives Cecil had destroyed. "We need something more," Bernard said quietly. "A slip-up, a mistake, anything we can use." Then, as if fate had heard his plea, Bernard's phone buzzed. It was Hector. "I've got eyes on him," Hector's voice came through the earpiece. "It's him, Bernard. I'm sure of it." Bernard's heart raced. "Where?" "Soho, one of the bars we've been watching. He's with a woman. Looks like he's working his charm on her." Bernard shot up from his chair, adrenaline surging through him. "Don't lose him. We're on our way." Cynthia and Bernard wasted no time. Within minutes, they were speeding through the dark streets of New York, heading for the upscale bar where Hector had spotted Cecil. The familiar hum of the city surrounded them, but Bernard's mind was focused solely on the man they were hunting. Cecil Franklin had slipped through their fingers too many times. This time, Bernard was determined not to let him get away. When they arrived, Bernard scanned the dimly lit interior of the bar, his eyes searching for Hector. He spotted him near the back, casually seated at a small table, his eyes trained on Cecil. Bernard followed Hector's gaze to the bar, where Cecil stood, engaged in conversation with a stunning brunette. The woman was laughing, completely unaware of the danger she was in. Bernard's stomach twisted with a mix of anticipation and dread. This was their chance, but they couldn't afford to rush it. "Let's not blow this," Bernard whispered to Cynthia. "We need to wait for the right moment. We need him to make a move first." Cynthia nodded, her eyes never leaving Cecil. "We can't afford another slip-up." As they watched from a distance, Cecil leaned in closer to the woman, his hand resting lightly on her back as he spoke. The woman smiled, oblivious to the predator beside her. Bernard clenched his fists, struggling to maintain his composure. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. They needed hard evidence, something they could use to put Cecil behind bars. But then something shifted. Bernard saw it in Cecil's posture, in the way his eyes flickered across the room. Cecil had noticed them. "He's on to us," Bernard murmured. Without warning, Cecil leaned in and whispered something to the woman, his expression calm, composed. Then, with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times before, he gently guided her toward the exit, his charming smile never faltering. "Go," Bernard hissed, and Cynthia was already moving, slipping through the crowd to cut off Cecil's exit. Bernard bolted for the back entrance, his heart pounding. He had to reach Cecil before he disappeared again. The narrow hallway leading to the restrooms felt like a maze as Bernard rounded a corner, hoping to intercept the man who had haunted their investigation for months. But when he got there, Cecil was gone. Cynthia appeared moments later, her expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. "He's gone. Again." Bernard cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the wall. "He's not just good, he's a phantom. Every time we get close, he slips away." They stepped back into the bar, scanning the crowd one last time, but it was no use. Cecil had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the faint trace of his presence, like a ghost in the night. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, the sounds of laughter and music drifting through the air. Bernard and Cynthia stood in the alley, the weight of failure pressing down on them. "We'll get him," Cynthia said, her voice firm. "We just have to figure out where he'll strike next. He's bold, Bernard. He's not going to stop, and neither are we." Bernard nodded, though his mind was already racing, trying to piece together the next move. Cecil Franklin was still out there somewhere in the city, preying on his next victim. But Bernard wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not until Cecil was behind bars, stripped of the power and privilege that had allowed him to wreak havoc on so many lives. The hunt was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Bernard, Cynthia, and Hector would dig deeper into the web of deceit Cecil had spun around himself, and eventually, the Weasel would run out of places to hide. The game was on, and Bernard Miller was ready to play. Part 2. The Trap tightens. The frustration of losing Cecil yet again gnawed at Bernard. It wasn't just that the man was elusive. He was calculated, a master manipulator who moved through society with ease, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. But Bernard knew that even the smartest criminals made mistakes. It was only a matter of time before Cecil did too. The following morning, Bernard convened with Toussaint and Ramirez in his home office. The room was filled with tense energy as they went over every detail from the previous night. "He knew we were onto him," Bernard said, pacing around the room. "The second he saw me, he bolted. He's always a step ahead. We can't keep trailing him and waiting for him to make a mistake. We need to force his hand." Ramirez leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We've tracked him to 5 different bars, and every time he slipped away, there's gotta be something we're missing." Toussaint, always the voice of reason, sifted through the case files in front of her. "He's been picking women from similar social circles. Events, bars, restaurants, they're all connected. What if we use that against him? Make him think he's safe, then trap him." Bernard paused, considering her words. Toussaint had a point. We could stage something, create an event he can't resist, and lure him in. "But how?" Ramirez asked. "He's not stupid. He'll see through any setup." Toussaint closed the file in front of her, her eyes sharp. "We need a real target. Someone who can play the part. Someone who won't scare him off." Bernard's mind immediately went to Susan Benetti. She was beautiful, smart, and capable of handling herself in tricky situations. They had crossed paths before when Bernard helped her out of a messy legal situation involving her corrupt ex-boyfriend. She was a perfect fit for their plan, and she had her own reasons for wanting to help catch a predator like Cecil. A few days later, the plan was in motion. Susan agreed to play the role of the bait, attending an upcoming charity gala for the city's social elite. Cecil wouldn't be able to resist. The gala, hosted in an opulent midtown hotel, was exactly the kind of event where Cecil prowled for victims, fancy enough to blend in, but exclusive enough to target the vulnerable. Bernard, Ramirez, and Toussaint worked behind the scenes to ensure everything was in place. Susan would go in alone, acting as any other guest, mingling and drawing Cecil's attention. Once he made contact, they'd follow his every move, ready to pounce the moment he slipped up. Bernard didn't like putting Susan in harm's way, but she insisted. Her determination to see justice done mirrored his own, and she had a knack for handling danger. The night of the gala arrived, and Susan was ready. Dressed in an elegant black evening gown that turned heads, she entered the grand ballroom with the grace of someone who belonged there. She was no stranger to this world of high society, making her the perfect choice for the role. Her dark hair was styled in soft waves, and she wore just enough jewelry to attract attention without appearing ostentatious. Bernard watched from a nearby surveillance van parked discreetly outside the hotel, his eyes glued to the live camera feed. Inside, Ramirez and Toussaint were stationed in strategic positions, blending into the crowd as guests while keeping a close watch on Susan and everyone who approached her. It wasn't long before Cecil made his move. He spotted Susan from across the room, and Bernard saw it happen in real time. There was a flicker of interest in Cecil's eyes, that same calculated gaze he used to choose his victims. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, engaging in polite conversation, shaking hands, and flashing that disarming smile that had fooled so many before. Finally, Cecil approached Susan, a drink in hand and his charm turned up to full power. "Good evening," Cecil said smoothly, offering her the drink. "You looked like you could use a refreshment." Susan smiled, accepting the glass but not drinking. "Thank you. I don't think we've met before." "That's a shame," Cecil replied, his green eyes locking onto hers. "I'm Cecil." She played her part perfectly, feigning just the right amount of interest without coming off as too eager. They exchanged pleasantries, and Bernard's pulse quickened as he watched the interaction unfold. This was it. If they could keep him engaged long enough, they'd finally have him. But Cecil wasn't a fool. As the night wore on, he made subtle moves to test Susan's vulnerability, offering to take her for a private drink, suggesting they leave the gala for somewhere quieter. Susan, playing her role, flirted back, but she never crossed the line. Cecil began to grow wary, sensing that something wasn't quite right. As Bernard watched the two of them dance through conversation, he started to worry. Cecil was picking up on something. His movements grew more deliberate, his eyes scanning the room like a predator assessing whether or not to strike. Bernard leaned closer to the screen, heart pounding. "He's on to us," Ramirez whispered through his earpiece. "I don't like this man. What if he bails?" "Stay calm," Bernard replied. "Susan can handle herself." But just as the tension was about to snap, something unexpected happened. Cecil, perhaps thinking he was being paranoid, suddenly relaxed again. He smiled warmly at Susan, placing a hand on her back, guiding her gently toward the exit. "He's making his move," Toussaint said quietly. "We've got to be ready." Cecil led Susan outside, where the cool night air enveloped them. The rooftop bar, bathed in the glow of the Manhattan skyline, was quiet, with only a few scattered guests. Susan followed his lead, still playing the role of an unsuspecting target. But beneath her composed exterior, her mind was racing, calculating each of Cecil's moves. Bernard, Toussaint, and Ramirez were already in position, hidden among the rooftop's shadows, watching the scene unfold. Bernard's nerves were stretched thin, knowing that one wrong move could cost them everything. They needed Cecil to act, to make a clear move that would incriminate him beyond a shadow of a doubt. As Cecil poured drinks for the both of them, Susan subtly moved her glass aside, making sure not to consume anything he handed her. Cecil, undeterred, leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're different," he said, his voice laced with charm. "Most women I meet at these things are so predictable. But you," he trailed his finger along the rim of her glass, "there's something about you." Susan smiled, but inside she was holding her breath, waiting for him to slip. And then, finally, it happened. With a quick flick of his hand, Cecil discreetly slipped a small vial into her drink. It was the same move he had used with his previous victims, the same deadly charm masking his predatory intentions. But this time, Bernard and his team were watching. Bernard's eyes locked onto the screen, adrenaline surging. "There it is," he muttered into his earpiece. "We've got him." Toussaint and Ramirez, already in motion, moved swiftly toward Cecil. But Susan was one step ahead. Just as Cecil was about to encourage her to take a sip, she placed her hand over his, stopping him mid-motion. "You really think I'm that stupid?" she whispered, her voice low but laced with menace. For a split second, Cecil's charming facade cracked. His eyes widened in shock, and before he could react, Susan twisted his wrist, forcing the vial from his hand. It clattered to the ground, rolling away as Cecil stumbled back, his suave demeanor evaporating. The sound of the vial hitting the floor seemed to echo across the rooftop, drawing the attention of the few patrons nearby. Cecil's gaze darted toward the exits, panic flashing in his eyes for the first time. He knew the game was up. Bernard saw the shift in his demeanor. Gone was the confident predator, replaced by a cornered animal desperate to escape. Cecil bolted toward the nearest exit, shoving past a couple standing near the railing. Bernard was already in pursuit, his long strides carrying him swiftly across the rooftop. Toussaint and Ramirez followed close behind, their earpieces buzzing with coordinated commands. "Susan, stay put," Bernard ordered through his earpiece. "We've got him." The chase was on. Cecil burst through the rooftop door, flying down the stairwell with reckless abandon. He had clearly underestimated Bernard and his team, but now he was running on pure survival instinct. Bernard was only a few steps behind, his heart pounding in his chest as he descended flight after flight of stairs. The hotel was vast, and Cecil was fast, but Bernard's determination was stronger. As they neared the lower floors, Cecil took a sharp turn, barreling through a side door into a service corridor. The dimly lit hallway was narrow and cluttered with supplies, making it difficult for Bernard to keep pace. But he wasn't about to let Cecil escape. Up ahead, Ramirez was cutting through the building's main entrance, positioning himself to intercept Cecil. Toussaint was communicating with hotel security, ensuring all exits were covered. The net was closing in. Cecil burst out into the back alley, the cool night air hitting his face like a slap. His breath came in ragged gasps as he looked frantically for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. Ramirez emerged from the shadows, blocking the alley's only exit, his gun drawn and pointed squarely at Cecil. "Don't even think about it," Ramirez warned, his voice calm but firm. Cecil froze, his eyes darting between Ramirez and the looming brick walls around him. He was trapped. Bernard arrived moments later, breathless but triumphant. He stood a few feet away from Cecil, his expression hard as stone. "It's over, Cecil," Bernard said, his voice low but steady. "There's nowhere left to run." For a moment it seemed like Cecil might surrender. His shoulders sagged and the fight drained from his body. But then, in one last desperate move, he reached into his jacket, fumbling for something hidden inside. Before anyone could react, there was a loud crack, a gunshot. Cecil staggered backward, clutching his chest, his face twisted in shock and pain. He crumpled to the ground, his hand falling limp beside him. The gun he had drawn slid across the pavement, useless now. Bernard rushed forward, checking Cecil's pulse. There was none. Part 3, the conclusion. The crack of the gunshot echoed off the brick walls, hanging in the air like a grim punctuation to the frantic chase. Bernard knelt over Cecil's lifeless body, his pulse hammering in his ears as he checked for any sign of life. There was none. Blood pooled beneath Cecil's chest, seeping through the expensive suit that had once been his disguise in this world. The predator was dead, but Bernard's heart didn't settle. The end felt hollow, unfinished. Ramirez approached, his gun still drawn, scanning the alley as if expecting someone else to jump out of the shadows. But there was no one. Only the muffled sounds of the city around them, oblivious to the life that had just been snuffed out in the dark, narrow passage. Toussaint arrived moments later, her eyes immediately locking onto Bernard and the motionless figure at his feet. "Is he dead?" Bernard confirmed, his voice flat. "He went for a gun," Toussaint cursed under her breath, taking in the scene. Cecil, for all his calculating genius, had made his final mistake. His last desperate move to escape had sealed his fate. Ramirez holstered his weapon, breathing deeply to steady his nerves. "It's done. We got him." But Bernard felt no sense of victory. The whole thing felt wrong, too sudden, too clean. Cecil had spent years eluding justice, years perfecting the art of manipulation. And now, after all that, he was gone in a single chaotic moment. "He didn't seem like the type to go out like this," Bernard muttered, staring down at Cecil's body. "Too careful, too smart." Toussaint crouched beside him, studying the scene with a detective's practiced eye. He was cornered, Bernard. Sometimes even the smartest ones panic when they know the game's over. Bernard nodded, but something still gnawed at him. Cecil had always been a step ahead, always calculating his moves. And now, here he was, dead in a grimy alley, his plans unraveled. It didn't sit right. "Let's get this cleaned up," Ramirez said, his voice laced with wariness. "We'll call it in, and the forensics team will take over." As they made the call, Bernard's mind wandered back to the moment Cecil had reached into his jacket. He replayed the scene in his head, wondering if there had been any other option. Had Cecil truly gone for a gun, or had he simply been desperate? Bernard shook the thought from his mind. There was no room for doubt now. It was over. Hours later, the alley was flooded with flashing lights as the NYPD descended on the scene. Detectives, crime scene investigators, and medical personnel moved in and out, documenting every inch of the space where Cecil had made his final stand. Bernard, Toussaint, and Ramirez stood off to the side, watching as the body was bagged and carried away. The tension that had gripped them all night was finally starting to ease, though none of them felt the release they had expected. "You all right?" Ramirez asked, eyeing Bernard. Bernard shrugged. "I don't know. I thought I'd feel more closure." "Closure doesn't always come easy in our line of work," Toussaint added quietly. "Sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's not satisfying, but the important thing is that Cecil won't hurt anyone else." Bernard knew she was right, but it didn't make the hollow feeling inside him go away. He had pursued Cecil for months, maybe even longer, in ways he hadn't realized. And now that the chase was over, the victory rang hollow. What they had just witnessed was less a triumph of justice and more a bitter inevitability. The next day, Bernard found himself back at his office, sorting through case files, trying to distract himself. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor as he shuffled through paperwork. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Cecil, to that final confrontation in the alley. A knock at the door pulled him out of his reverie. Susan Benetti walked in, looking a little worse for wear, but still carrying herself with the same grace and confidence that had made her such a perfect decoy for their plan. She smiled softly at Bernard. though there was a sadness behind her eyes. "Mind if I come in?" she asked. Bernard gestured to a chair, and she sat down, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I heard about last night," Susan said quietly. "Is it true? Cecil's really gone?" "Yeah," Bernard replied, leaning back in his chair. "He's gone." Susan nodded, though there was no relief in her expression. "I should feel better about this. I wanted him caught. I wanted him to pay for everything he's done. But now that it's over—" "I know the feeling," Bernard said, echoing her sentiment. "We got what we wanted, but it doesn't feel like a win." For a moment, they sat in silence, both of them trying to make sense of their emotions. Susan had been instrumental in setting the trap for Cecil, but now, even with the threat eliminated, the victory felt empty. "You did your part, Susan," Bernard said, breaking the silence. "You helped stop him." "I just wish it hadn't ended the way it did," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I wanted him to face justice. Real justice. Not this." "I wanted that too," Bernard admitted. "But some people, they don't give you a choice." Later that afternoon, Bernard met with Toussaint and Ramirez one final time to close out the case. The three of them sat around the table in Bernard's office, going over the final reports, the forensics, and the autopsy results. Cecil had indeed been armed. His fingerprints were found on the gun, along with a small stash of other weapons he'd hidden in the lining of his jacket. He had come prepared for a fight, even if his calm exterior had hidden it. "You were right to trust your instincts," Toussaint said, reviewing the report. He was ready to shoot his way out if it came to that. Bernard nodded, though it didn't ease the lingering doubts in his mind. "I just can't shake the feeling that we missed something." Ramirez shrugged. "Cecil's dead, man. Whatever plans he had, they're buried with him now." "Maybe," Bernard said, still unconvinced. "But guys like Cecil, they don't usually go down without a backup plan." Toussaint and Ramirez exchanged glances, and Ramirez leaned forward, folding his arms across the table. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know yet," Bernard admitted. "But I want to go back through everything, his properties, his contacts, everything he's touched. I want to make sure he didn't leave any loose ends." Toussaint sighed but nodded. "We can help with that. If there's anything left behind, we'll find it." As the days passed, Bernard and his team delved deeper into Cecil's life. They uncovered hidden accounts, secret rendezvous, and layers of deception that went far beyond the initial investigation. Cecil had been building something bigger than they realized. A network of predators, a web of corruption that spanned across the city's elite. Even in death, Cecil was leaving his mark. But with each discovery, Bernard felt the satisfaction that had eluded him since that night in the alley. He had always known that Cecil was more than just a lone predator. Now, they had the chance to unravel the entire web he had woven, to bring down the people who had enabled him, who had profited from his darkness. The case was far from over, but Bernard no longer felt the emptiness that had plagued him. The trap had closed on Cecil, but the real battle had just begun. And this time, Bernard wouldn't stop until every last thread was pulled. It's pulled. It's pulled. It's pulled.